For Africa, we now cross live to Pretoria, where we're joined by Professor Dirk Kotze, who's the head of political studies at UNISA, and he's standing by. Professor, thank you very much for joining us. Firstly, give us your thoughts and your impressions about this year's candidates for the US. And a lot of people are probably wondering why we are so intrigued, but what happens in America generally does affect what happens in other parts of the world, and our continent is not excluded.
Yes, that's indeed so. The American policy towards Africa over the past 8 years were very pronounced in many different areas. On the one hand, over in 2008, the AFRICOM, the military command for Africa, the American military command for Africa, was established as a vehicle also not only for military and security purposes, but also for the implementation of American policy in many respects. We have also in South Africa, for example, we see the presence of the US in the form of their support for health projects like the HIV/AIDS project, which is quite an important one, and South Africa over time received a lot of money for that. At my own university, UNISA, there's a lot of money that the US is spending through their development agency for the development of electoral commissions all over the continent of Africa. Then at the same time, the US is also spending a lot of money as well as providing support, for example, for the development and training of peacekeeping capabilities on the continent. They've trained more than 248,000 soldiers, African soldiers, in 25 countries in order to do that. So there's a huge spectrum of Americans' presence in different African countries, specifically in South Africa also.
All right, so if we look at the two candidates, for some reason, business seems to be wanting Hillary Clinton. We're seeing even some Republicans, maybe the more traditional Republicans, also not completely enamored with their own candidate. Is there a specific reason that business is looking towards Hillary Clinton, and our markets seem to be reacting positively towards the idea that Hillary Clinton might win this election? Does that mean that a Clinton victory is better for Africa?
Not necessarily so. Traditionally, many Africans, many South Africans believe that the Democratic Party is more sympathetic towards Africa in general, or towards South Africa also. But the history has shown us that it's not necessarily the case. I know from a person very close to President Mbeki, who told him that he considers George W. Bush, and that's very ironic, as the last president who really made a major contribution to Africa, partly through AGOA, the African Growth and Opportunities Act, that has been renewed or renegotiated earlier this year with respect to South Africa also. I think what is regarded as the plus point for a Democratic candidate or Democratic president is that they have also more support from the African Americans in the US itself, and therefore it creates a general link or relationship with the African continent in general. But I think if we look at the specific relationships, then in some cases it does not really matter which of the two candidates will in the end be the president, because when it comes to Africa, they follow more or less the same policy, or they have the different Republican and Democratic presidents have followed more or less the same type of policy, and irrespective of the party philosophy that they support.
So we know what Donald Trump has thought about Mexicans, Hispanics, and even Muslims. He's spoken quite loudly about that. Do we have any idea what his views on Africa are?
No, we don't know. During the whole period, about the past 18 months of the campaign, first the primaries and now the final campaign, he hardly spoke about Africa in general. He spoke more about the East, he spoke about China, he spoke about Russia, obviously Europe and the UK and Latin America, but not about Africa. I think it's an indication that Africa is not very high on his priority list. And the same actually with Hillary Clinton. She did not pay much attention to Africa as a focus area for maybe her administration if she is elected.
Now, Hillary Clinton has been Foreign Secretary, and for those of us at home, that's, I suppose, equivalent to the Minister of Foreign Affairs. So she's been out there. We know what she's like in engaging with foreign nationals. So she won't be a surprise package, really, will she, when she takes up the presidency if she wins?
Yes, and I think that is why the business community in general, or the American business community, might have a little bit of a more support for her. She is definitely more predictable. She will most possibly, in the beginning at least, follow the trends or the policy principles, direction of President Obama to a large extent. Where there might be differences are with respect to some of the trade agreements that have been concluded between the US and especially Pacific Ocean countries, the so-called Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, that she is not in favor of that. So that might be revisited. But otherwise, I think she will try to follow a policy which is more pro-business or friendly towards business, but at the same time, she already promised that she wants to increase the taxes at least, so that she wants in the end to promote the middle class. And I think there is quite some consensus amongst many of the candidates in the earlier part of the campaign that one of the main problems in the American society today is the decline of the middle class in the US. And therefore she very much wants to revive the middle class. And for that there's all sorts of stimulus programs that she wants to create, including those through businesses. That is really the American approach, is not for the state to become involved in the economy and the creation of jobs, for example, employment opportunities, but to stimulate the economy through the private sector. And both of these candidates really follow that route.
So during the Cold War, Russia and America used to fight each other out to win the hearts and minds of the African continent. It seems as if Donald Trump is a little bit more friendly towards Vladimir Putin and Russia more than Hillary. Hillary seems to be a little bit more annoyed. Where do we fall in that spectrum if this plays out? Because it does seem that Trump is perhaps much more amenable to some kind of Russia-America love fest.
Yes, and that is very much accused or blamed for that by the opposition, by the Democrats, and specifically by Hillary Clinton. Last night, even by President Obama, when he was presenting one of his last speeches on the campaign trail. And there is at least a suspicion, there's very little concrete evidence about it, but there's the suspicion that Russia prefers Donald Trump, and that they are very critical of Hillary Clinton. The current situation, the relationship between the US and Russia obviously is very tense. The US and the current administration, the Obama administration, is accusing Russia that they've become involved in the election campaign through the hacking that they say is supported by the defense ministry, the Russian defense ministry. That is then leaked to WikiLeaks. That's the accusation that exists. And that as a result of that, the Russians have a direct interest in the outcome of this election and try to manipulate it. At the same time, we know about the relationship and the tension between the US and Russia with respect to Syria, because to a large extent they are the two main key players in order to determine what is the immediate future of Russia and whether there will be a ceasefire or some talks that will commence. But at this stage, in very many respects, they are actually opponents in the conflict in Syria. So that heightened and increases the tension between the US and Russia at the moment.
Well, let's carry on this theme then of security. And one of the things that America has relied on, particularly with some African states, is the assistance in fighting terror or terror threats. Do we have different approaches between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton in terms of the relationship with Africa? I'm thinking about countries like Kenya, countries like South Africa even, in terms of this fight against terror.
We haven't seen much of or heard much of that yet from the two candidates. But I think when either of them have been elected, there won't necessarily be much of a difference in approach. The US, the consensus in the US amongst the security personnel, especially the military, is that they are very much united in the effort to confront terrorism in general. Their main focus earlier on, around about 2012, when they formulated their defense strategy and their security strategy was very much directed at Al-Qaeda. At that stage, that was regarded as the main threat. But in the meantime, Boko Haram in Nigeria have become very much prominent. Al-Shabaab in Somalia have become very prominent. So as a result of that, I think their focus is much broader than what it was 2-3 years ago. But that is their main approach. I've mentioned in the beginning the formation of AFRICOM, the African Command of the Defense Force, the American Defense Force, and they want to use that as a vehicle in order to develop military and security relationships with almost all African countries. Their main objective is to try to identify so-called frail states or failed states, and Somalia is one example of that for them. And then countries where there is a high risk for that to develop, like South Sudan, and the US has very important interest and vested interest in South Sudan. So they become involved in that respect in order to try to prevent the situation from deteriorating. At the same time, they are involved in lots of training all over the continent of the military, of police, of intelligence, all sorts of security personnel in order to confront terrorism in general. Then I've mentioned earlier on also the fact that they want to develop the peacekeeping capacity, because the doctrine that the Americans have developed over the past few years is to say that they don't want directly to be involved in peacekeeping, but rather to develop the capacity for African countries and the African Union. And by developing such a close relationship between the African Union and African countries and the US with respect to peacekeeping, it will in effect benefit both sides, the US as well as the African countries.
All
so
right.
that appears to be at this stage the main focus of the US approach.
All right, we're running out of time, but one last question perhaps. Which one of the two, if they won the presidency, would be most likely to visit Africa in the near term?
I think Hillary Clinton will do that. There have been President Clinton, Bill Clinton was in South Africa a number of times. We all know that his friendship with President Mandela was very close. He was here for the funeral of President Mandela. She was also here. So they are quite familiar with South Africa. I don't think Donald Trump has ever been in Southern Africa or other parts of Africa.
All right. Professor Dirk Coetzee, thank you very much indeed for sharing your insights with us on this historic day that's taking place in the US. Thank you very much for your time, sir.